guest speaker, Sofía Hernández Chong Cuy. And this is actually a partnership with the third collaboration I think we've had with Bellas Artes, bringing in foreign guest speakers. And this particular session is also made possible with the support of the Embassy of the Netherlands. So, if I may, we'd like to introduce the ambassador, Her Excellency Saskia Delang, to give some welcome remarks.
Thank you very much. To stand here and can oversee the whole meeting room. Dear Mrs. Ruth Herrera, dear Mrs. Kai Aboitis, the leadership of the art gallery Ateneo, Mrs. Chong Cuy, and dear participants. We are very proud at the Netherlands Embassy to have Sofía Hernández Chong Cuy, the curator of the Contemporary Visual Art Museum Witte de With in Rotterdam, here in Manila. And I'm very pleased that our embassy was able to sponsor the trip to Manila. I'm always struck that the language of art is a universal one. Wherever you are in the world, you can relate to the locally produced art. And my first weekend in Manila, that was about 6 months ago, it coincided with the Art Fair Philippines. And I didn't have any previous knowledge about the Philippines art scene at that time. And I was somehow put off by the venue. It was a 4-storied parking garage. But when I arrived there, I was absolutely overwhelmed by the creativity and the fearless ambition of the Filipino artists that were on display there. And I was also overwhelmed by the public, visiting families or groups of young people. All ages were present, and thus witnessing the demand for beauty and for art in all its forms among the urban Filipinos of all walks of life. And later, I hosted a recognition night for Prince Claus Award laureate Kidlat Tahimik. He's a director, he's an actor, and he's called the father of the Philippines independent film. And that was at the Bellas Artes venue. Kidlat is an artist who stands close to the people and to whom many in the Philippines can relate because he translates their dreams, their fears, and their emotions into something visible and tangible and sustainable. Dear Mrs. Chong Cuy, I believe you are in the right place to speak about contemporary artistic practices, about collective learning and cultural institutions. And the subject of your talk will be understood because of the universality of art. And with your career that spans over different continents and your background in different cultures, you are an incarnation of the universality of art. My country, the Netherlands, has been and still is the cradle of magnificent art forms, developed through contacts with the world abroad, taking inspiration from other European countries, from the Orient, and also from the imagined world of the Bible. Throughout the centuries, many of our artists lived abroad and brought home new images, colors, and schemes. They helped to create an understanding for the world outside our own. The cross-fertilization works in different directions, and international exchange is a must for artists and for the role they play in society. Therefore, I'm very grateful for Bellas Artes for promoting such exchange and for hosting today's event, and also for the Art Gallery Ateneo for hosting this event. Thank you for your kind attention, and over to the next speaker.
I'd like to introduce the Artistic Director of Bellas Artes to formally introduce our speaker. Sorry.
Don't worry. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Ambassador, for beautiful words. Extremely well crafted, I feel now. That I'll be very humbled to just give a little bit of words that I will say in a very natural way, because Sofía, I've known of her work and have had the chance to see some of the exhibitions she has done in that biography that you just mentioned. But just to give you a little bit of an introduction, Sofía is from Mexico, but she worked in New York as directing art in general and doing incredible projects with the diversity of the art community there. She was the director of a public state museum in Mexico City called the Tamaño, which has a beautiful collection. Anybody who might have a chance to visit Mexico, you should visit. Definitely one of those key museums is the Tamaño. She was also working as the director of an art institution and cultural diplomatic center called Asia Society, and she was most recently one of the curators that was part of a team that formed the Documenta about now 6 years ago. And she's now directing, before coming to the Witte de With, which is the art center that she will be talking more about today. She was the curator of contemporary art of an art foundation that has a collection called the Cisneros Foundation. And Sofía, we're very happy that you're here. I think there are many connections historically between the geographies that she's worked with, especially where she comes from, Mexico also being extremely connected to the history of the Philippines. So without further ado, thank you. And I would like to also thank Ateneo, all the team. Thank you so much for this collaboration. And just again, sorry, very briefly, Sofía's talk and the workshop that we have later in the afternoon with some of you in the room is part of an education program called Eskwela. If you want to know more about that program, go online. It's eskwela.com. And that's it.
Thank you. Thank you to the museum here, the gallery, the University Gallery, to Inte Guerrero, and to the Embassy of the Netherlands in the Philippines. Thank you, Inte, very much for the invitation here. It is my first time in the Philippines, and I am very pleased to have been invited not only to give a talk, which will also be very casual and informal, even though the setting is quite informal, and also to be able to do the workshop in the afternoon. I have to say that I'm better at the workshop than in the lecturing part, and that has to do with the way in which I preferred to have a kind of more dynamic relationship to participants in a program and to audiences. But for this presentation, what I'm going to basically do is I'm going to run the slideshow automatically. I suppose that maybe you've already read the first slide there. And I want to run the slideshow automatically because things will begin getting, images might become more readable once I speak a little bit about the history of our institution, about what we do, and how we consider not only creating an institutional practice that is innovative, but also how we consider that collective learning, meaning learning with others and about others, is a way in which we take on pedagogy and curatorial practice into consideration, meaning how we build a program that acknowledges other forms of learning and other kinds of knowledge beyond what we consider quote-unquote contemporary art. So the slideshow, as said, will run automatically as I give you a little bit of the history of our institution and how we've incorporated collective learning into our institutional practice. We were founded in 1990, or opened to the public in 1990. The actual foundation is called a stichting, which is what you could consider a non-profit institution in the Netherlands. And as a stichting, we were registered in 1989. It's an important year for many different reasons. As you know, it's the year where the USSR broke into what it is today, into different countries. It is a year in which many new democracies were emerging in the Americas. It is a year of a lot of imagination. It's a year of many discussions that opened up at that time. And 1989 is also an important year for many institutions, is about in the arts, specifically in the contemporary arts. A lot of interest in exchange began merging there, whether it was between countries, between corporations and art institutions and so on. That year, 1989, was the birth legally of our institution, so 30 years ago. The institution, Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art, opened to the public on January 27th of 1990. And it opened in a repurposed school building. So I'm very interested in the Eskwela of the Bellas Artes projects, and of course in many other institutions that have taken sites or created their activities in former or repurposed school buildings. It was ours constructed in the late 19th century, in the 1870s. And it operated as a building in the Witte de With Straat, which is the street called Witte de With. When the institution created its mandates at its foundation, it presented a very clear line. It is to present contemporary art and theory. And I wanted to focus on the theory part a little bit, because presenting contemporary art is something that we generally know of museums that have that in their title. But the fact that it presented and theory is important, because it was in the 1980s when the art world, to a large extent, began posing a number of questions that we know as today as post-colonial questions, or cultural studies questions, or questions around visual art and not exactly the fine arts. In the 1980s, a number of exhibitions and institutions turned their mirada, turned their perspective into what we call today the Global South. It was a period of time in which a lot of consideration or questioning about the Western art historical canon was raised. Questions around domination, questions around subjugation, questions around colonial thinking and post-colonial thought were the main discussions of what we can consider the trade magazines, whether it was magazines or discussions in forums that were happening in the so-called capitals of the art world. So whether it was in Paris or New York or in London, where all these concentrated discussions were taking place, the question was, what happens to all the art histories and to all the visual imagery that is not being produced in these centers? What do we do with them? How do they relate to the so-called life or contemporaneity or even histories of modernism that we are indebted to? So the center, Witte de With, it was very clear that its mandate was just not only to present contemporary art, but to present theory of contemporary practice. And since its inception of its programs in 1990, most of the artists and ideas that it began discussing and introducing by way of exhibitions and publications dealt with artists that were not part of the centers. It brought in artists from Latin America, it brought in artists from the African continent, and it brought artists, of course, from the cities that were considered capital, whether that was London, Paris, and New York, as mentioned before. But it already brought them considering the cultural background or the geographical and national identity that these artists were promoting through their art making. The 1990s was a kind of boom of the arts also in Rotterdam. It was a period where the first, you can even consider the first roving biennale, Manifesta, took place in that city of Rotterdam. It's a city that was in a height of development because it was still at that time the most important port of the world. Now it's the second largest port after Shanghai, but it enjoyed a kind of capacity of presenting that the institution was a way, was a place in which things came in and out, that it connected it pretty much internationally on a global scale. A city that was small, but that was diverse in many ways. That's the birth of our institution. In 1990, opening its doors to the public. Now, the institution, Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art, as it was named in 1989 when the papers were signed, was very aware of what was happening again internationally. And in fact, the people that founded the institution had done a research during the late 80s to other institutions to get a sense of what Witte de With could be, to get a sense of in what capacity it could contribute to its city in Rotterdam. They were policymakers and art advocates, and basically decided that the Center for Contemporary Art would not only be placed in a repurposed school building that was actually active for the first number of years. There was a school in the bottom floors, and in the upper floors was the Contemporary Art Center. So students were going in downstairs, and art visitors were going upstairs to see the venue. They were also aware that this institution could serve to reactivate a street that connected two other institutions. On the one hand, the Maritime Museum, which was located on the east of the street, the east end of the street, and on the west end of the street was the Museum Park. But between those two museums, between the Maritime and the Museum Park, the street was not doing so well, so to say. The school, in fact, had abandoned floors upstairs because it was already looking into relocating to another part of the city. What happened was that the city, when placing the institution there, decided to consider that this center would ignite, to a large extent, the neighborhood into a different kind of cultural venue in the city, and into a kind of art district. And so it did, and they decided to name the institution based on its street name, Witte de With Center. It wasn't until a couple of years ago that in a move in general that is happening in the Netherlands around decolonizing, that the name of the institution was questioned. If it always was associated to the name of the street, Witte de With Center, at this point in 2017, the names of streets, the names of institutions, and certainly monuments throughout the Netherlands had begun under a kind of critical process of questioning based on the decolonizing moves that are happening in the country. The critics of 2017 called upon Witte de With to explain why it took the name not only of the street, but in what way did it consider that its activities did a critical reflection on a theoretical level if it had not already questioned its own identity. And just to give a footnote to that, Witte de With was a naval Dutch officer in the 17th century that was part of a ship that invaded Jakarta. Again, this is in the 17th century. And the institution in 2017 was to some extent aware that Witte de With was a naval Dutch officer, but did not consider necessary the questioning of having taken the street name, and in that sense the namesake of the Dutch officer of the 17th century, as a point of contestation. Discussions have very much developed since the critiques of 2017, but ultimately it was also that year when the institution decided that there would be a name change of the institution, so that the name Witte de With, which is already associated to an exhibition program and certainly to the street, would be separated from the name of the institution. How that happened, in order to acknowledge the importance of heritage, has been the question that we've been dealing with in the last couple of years. And one of the ways in which we have taken that task has been, again, through activities of collective learning. Meaning it is not about removing the name so easily, but about transforming our institution so that it acknowledges unheard or unvoiced or unseen or unrepresented voices in the field of the Netherlands. So the name change initiative, in a way, is a way for us to collectively learn what has been missed out from the writing of history and what could be included or acknowledged in the process through the visual arts of that same heritage that is shared but unaccounted for. Witte de With is Witte de With has, as an institution, or rather right now during my tenure as an institution, we have taken very seriously the fact that our building was formerly a school, an all-women school, and that it remains being a site of learning for the activities, meaning regardless of the fact that there are no former classes and teachers and students, We consider that exhibitions are classrooms, and that the way in which art is presented is a form of pedagogy, is a form of learning, not only from the artists, but for the public as well. So a couple of things have happened, and I think that the only things that we've sort of shied away from is to think only thematically. So most of the exhibitions or most of the curatorial practices that take on so-called political subjects tend to be representational. And by that I mean figurative, which is great, but I'm also interested in making changes that are infrastructural, meaning that they are not only architectural, but are also programmatic. How we hire people being one, how we use our exhibition spaces, for example, as multi-purpose spaces being a second one. And the third, and most importantly, is how we slowly but surely change the policy and the visions of our institution. And so that it is not just, say, changing a name or making an exhibition about a colonial or decolonial subject, but instead how we actually work, how the processes of engagement between the staff and with the public for the arts has actually changed. One of the main changes then, in which this visual presentation that you're seeing here is based on, is that the first move in terms of this name change initiative was to rethink our main exhibition space, which is in the ground floor gallery space. The ground floor gallery space used to be, for many years, covered. The windows were darkened, and they were very high, and you had to pay, obviously, admission tickets to go in and see what was there. The building is very imposing. Again, it's a 19th century building in a kind of neoclassical style. And the first thing that happened in a move towards gaining a much more closer relationship to the public into the context of the street was done about 10 years ago, which was bringing that down the windows architecturally in the museum. The second change, which did happen only last year, was a change that more important gallery space, which is directly connected to the street, would not be used to present autonomous art. And by autonomous art, I mean objects in a space that are contextualized or that are so-called discrete and contextualized by the institution and by didactics, meaning artworks that are standalone pieces, whether it's a sculpture or a painting or an installation that you enter. Instead, what we would do was that we would present works that could interact more directly to the architecture of the space. And so the space would have an envelope, literally an envelope, or be used as an envelope, which eventually ended up being the title of the first artwork that we presented there, which was a mural by Federico Herrero. The space would be then filled, floor and walls and ceiling, with a mural painting and with an all-purpose painting that you would enter. The second thing was that we would make that space not just a space where that artwork or painting would be presented, but that we would use it as a classroom, and that we would use it as a bookshop, and that we would use it as a kind of cantina, as a space where you could go and read books, buy them, you could go have coffee and sit there, you could have an event such as this one and learn. So the gallery space is transformed right now into a type of exhibition, type of multi-purpose space, in which most of the events get presented there Fridays and Saturdays, some of them on Sundays. The space is now still presented theoretically as a gallery space. Now there's a second exhibition there, which is of posters, and a third exhibition comes up there at the end of the year. There is an idea that also the programming is long-term, meaning that while the exhibitions that take place there are about a year long, the events that are only every night or every afternoon are quickly. So there's two temporalities that run in the space. You can either go see an exhibition again and again because it's installed for a period of a year, or you could go to an event one Friday and never come back, or as it's happened today, come recurringly to the institution to participate in numerous events that range from artist talks to workshops and so on. In that sense, the infrastructure, the program of the exhibition has also changed in terms of what you invest your funds in. So the investment of funds that would have been dedicated primarily to the production of a single exhibition are now invested in the programming of a number of events and activities that take place on a more frequent way. So again, thinking that the investment is not only in terms of the time that is given by an audience to return back, but that the financial investment that the institution does in its programming is in this case to educational activities. I know it sounds very simple because it looks very simple, but just to change the very financial aspects and the very uses of the space has been a lot of negotiation in the mix. What I'm interested in, and I will show you these two images there, is to see how an institution can transform slowly, as it is with many of the activities that are taking place in the food sector, for example, or in the culinary world, how to change slowly so that the quality of relations that we have with our public can strengthen. The critiques of 2017 of the name of our institution, which, as I said, were part of a larger decolonizing movement, were not just solely, to my mind, critiques of the name that we had, but critiques to the fact that the institution had not locally engaged, or at least had not sufficiently engaged to a local scene as it could have done before. It presented that the institution, the critiques, the underlying critique, I would say, was based on the fact that it was not representative insofar as its program or of its audiences to the local constituencies that Rotterdam is now shaped of. It is a city that has the largest immigration community in the Netherlands. It is a city that is made up by citizens from all over the world. 167 nationalities are located within Rotterdam. That is, I don't know if you've been to Queens, New York, but that is pretty much like Queens. And it is a city that is very diverse precisely because in its very streets it exposes the cultural backgrounds from the many people that make up that town. It's also a port city. It's a city that is very proud of being a working class, that is very proud of not only being a port to the world, but that has had a history of working with the hands, of working not only in terms of craft, but of being very much associated to the manual labor that the port has historically and up until recently had. Of course, automation has shifted the city from being a working class that worked with its hands, with its body, to working now in terms of knowledge production and service-based economy. And those transitions, which are both economic and cultural, have left a specific question open and yet unanswered around how the Dutch can actually be represented within the programming of both a local scene and an international atmosphere. I believe that the critiques of 2017 of our name are pretty much directed to the most important one, which is around representation. If Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art has been always connected to an international art circuit, in what ways could the local internationalism be represented within its program as well? And so that means that the critiques are ones of cultural representation. And so collective learning for us has been to develop that program that is based on outreach, and I think that that could be done through recurring events and through understanding that the visual arts is not only the space of representation, but that through multivocal discussions, meaning discussions from many different perspectives, from many different cultural variations, could actually happen. I'm gonna leave it there so that it doesn't continue pausing. I'm actually gonna go to this slide. Another characteristic of Rotterdam that is quite important and that has to do with, or has been influencing the program as of late, is that Rotterdam is a very proud city to have reconstructed itself. And from my here from INTI, it's also something that maybe connects with Manila. Rotterdam was bombarded heavily during the Second World War, and it is very proud to have been reconstructed. Witte de With is actually, and you saw some of the images there, is in the city center, which was completely eliminated for exception of a couple of buildings. and Witte de With is just in the perimeter that survived the 1945 bombing. So again, the idea of reconstruction is one that is close to the city of Rotterdam and to the Rotterdammers. In the end, the program is developing. There is a high interest in, at the moment, thankfully our audience have increased based on these recurring programs. The exhibitions are more and more looking into artists, I would say, from the Global South, with many artists from Latin America, which is my expertise in the last decade being represented there, and to a move for the next year and slowly in the years to come to be more representative of the Global South, which is again part of the constituency even of Rotterdam as a city. So very briefly, what I wanted to have in this presentation was to have a conversation with Inti, hopefully, about the ways in which not only the Global South, but questions of representation and in general decolonizing has been impacting the programs of contemporary art institutions as of today. I'm very interested in how exhibitions can be sites of learning by reconsidering the white cube space of museums and pretty much of modernisms so that they can become spaces of activation that are much more multivocal and multi-purpose in its use, so that the display of objects is not just the priority or the primacy of the museums, that the White Cube Gallery, again, is reconsidered as a site of learning, or collective learning to be more precise, through the activation of objects and discussions that could take place there. There are a number of exhibitions at Witte de With. I just spoke about one gallery that is about 250 square foot, which is the gallery that you see there. Our building, which is rather large, has many other galleries where there are concurrently exhibitions happening at the same time. There is a very strong interest in the program for indigenous knowledge, and that means for knowledge that is not, again, based on the Western canons or scientific models, and that involves a lot of reconsideration to questions of even how to make pigment, which is or color, which is a very basic material used and theme theoretically used by artists. So a number of exhibitions have based on the origins of pigment to the origins of visual language that are syncretic and that involve the indigenous vision with the Western canons. So my hope is that I can have a conversation with Inti about this. The workshop will be very different, and I know that some of you are participating, dealing with 3 particular case studies in public space, with collections, and with islands, which I think are related very much to the region here, and that I'm hoping that it is fruitful. If you want to see a documentation of the exhibitions of Witte de With, there is a lot of images and a lot of sections in the website. So here in this presentation, what I wanted to show you was archival images that are unseen and for the first time reveals that they are taken from the city archives and that show the transformation not only of our building but of our city and the exhibition space. So Inti, hoping that this is a dialogue. Great. And of course this dialogue, I'm hoping that it opens to the public, yeah?
Thank you, Sofía.
Yeah.
And hearing you, it made me think of different connections also. I think just to have a dialogue with a reference that might be closer to Manila, and since the ambassador mentioned the art fair, I think there is definitely a phenomenon globally of a certain institutional looking back phenomenon of trying to understand what happened in the history of exhibitions and institutions. You might remember at the art fair in the Philippines there was an important display of the posters designed by Albano during the CCP with a reinstallment of an installation that he had done personally. And so there is, even in context of art fairs or art institutions, clear interest of looking back at the history of institutions to understand our present times, to try to learn what happened there, because they are spaces where the memory of an art community happens. It speaks of the ideology of the time, even the visual taste in terms of the graphics of the time.
Yeah.
And maybe, so in relation to that, to speak it in not specific terms of Witte de With, but since you travel so much with previous work and your current work, how do you see, or how could we understand a little bit of this phenomenon? Where do you think it's coming from, of looking back at that institutional history?
That's a very interesting question. I think that we're looking back. First of all, I want to say something that's quite important, is that I think that there are many questions that arise today that we know were questions that arose a century ago, and that we have to look at history to see how they were addressed, how those questions were addressed before, because the questions are happening. Those same questions are emerging at the moment. So I think that the only way that you can respond in an informed way is by looking back at history. And one of the questions that has arisen today with the whole discussion around decolonizing is, what does national identity mean? How is national identity constructed? And I think that those questions were very much part of the late 19th century, early 20th century. And they were addressed in quite interesting ways. And of course, the visual arts and the cultural diplomatic programs responded to those in the turn of the century, in the turn of the 20th century. And you could see that in revolutions, you could see that in modernizing projects that were from urban sector and so on. So I'm going to respond to the question in two forms, one with an example. For me, it's been very important to look back at the history of the institution, not only in terms of its programming, but in terms of its architecture. And that's why I've invited Michiel Huyven, who is a young visual artist in Rotterdam with an architectural history background, to join me on this research. What I mentioned to him was that in the research of thinking about changing the institution's name, we had to think about where we were, not just in terms of the street, Witte de With Center, but where we were in terms of our building. And I said, if our building was constructed in 1872, 1873, and if our street was named Witte de With Center in 1871, there must have been a coincidence. Meaning there must have been a reason for why a school building and a street were being erected at the same time. The street already existed, it was just renamed. And in further research, I understood that it was part of the 19th century, between the 1860s and the 1890s, was a very important time in the country, and the ambassador could give me perhaps more information here. But during that period of time, those decades were very important for creating a national identity in the Netherlands. And the way in which they happened was through, for example, creating by Thorenbeck from the south, a new educational system that would be installed in the country, of which that building is part of. It's a Hogerburger School for women specifically, which was an education program that for women in the 1870s, see? And it was a program that emerged in the 1860s. And there were a number of schools around the country, including the one in Rotterdam, that were founded. It was also the period of time in the same decades where a number of streets in the country and a number of monuments in the country were named after the Golden Age, after people that had been part of the construction of the Dutch East India Company, and that were involved in the expansion of the wealth of the nation. It wasn't in the 17th century or in the 18th century when the Golden Age was actually thought of. It was in the late 19th century. And so those two factors, and of course Blue Delft as the blue and white ceramic of the country, which was very important during the 17th century, and then died down, was reignited again as an object or as a craft in the 19th century. And so those are some of the indicators that, to me, make worthwhile looking back at history. Why was Blue Delft or blue and white ceramic? Why were the street names named that time? Why was an education system invented at that time as well? How did they solve it? How did they solve the nation? The importance of a culture, of making it a cultural identity, or making a national identity through culture. And it did it that way, by naming streets, by creating a new educational system, by identifying an iconic object of a global period of the 17th century back again into its own distribution. That's how the nation created that identity at that time. I think that if we understand, I can speak about the Mexican national identity as well. I mean, in terms of, it was in the 1910s, and what happened in that period of time, which was a revolution in the country, the cultural identity was based on emphasizing the indigenous roots of the country and creating it with more minor como visuality, the French, what Porfirio Diaz, the president or dictator beforehand, had taken to appreciate, which was the French modernism, architecture, furniture, and so on. And it was also in that period of time when the first Ministry of Education had been founded. So you had muralism, you had the Ministry of Education, etc., etc. You had streets that had changed and so on. So again, looking back into how national identities has been constructed, it is through culture, it is through naming, it is through education or through pedagogy, and it's through representational forms, basically. So looking back has to do with saying, if we want to create new identities today that are based on a multivocal society, then we have to look into pedagogy and we have to look into image makers. And so I think that that's why, on the one hand, we look back at history, to understand what is it today that we want to emphasize in regards to that. Now, that's an institutional response. Now I'm going to go into a curatorial response to the question. I think that looking back at the legacy of exhibition makers, we can find the ways in which knowledge has been spatialized. And so many of the exhibitions, again, of the 1980s, I actually do think that the last decades of centuries are fundamental. And this is not just in terms of Eric Hobsbawm to say we should look at turning points, right? I think that many of the exhibitions or the exhibition history that has been tapped as of late, that curators and art historians are looking back, are exhibitions that took place in the 1980s because it was, again, a period of time when there was a kind of dispute between modernist forms, particularly of abstraction, and representational forms, particularly of figuration. And that it was a moment in which the analysis of syncretic thinking, of thinking of this combination between the indigenous and the, how would I put it on the other hand, and the Western canon were meeting. They were meeting points. A lot of the curatorial projects that created a boom, an explosion, because they were seen with contempt or with admiration, were exhibitions that put the indigenous next to the so-called contemporary. And it didn't have to do just purely with image making. It had to do with forms of knowledge that were unaccepted as scientific, and that today, for example, are considered as scientific using other criteria. And so I think that there's a lot to learn from the exhibitions of the past, because many of them were in fact very criticized. And today those critiques are being reassessed, whether they were in fact actually so avant-garde that at the time they couldn't be understood in the way they're understood today. That's on a theoretical level. I also think that the relations that they drew were informed of exhibition display mechanisms that are reappropriated today because of their pedagogical innovation. meaning they were so inclined to be didactic, which I think is what we need today to understand the amount of languages that we have to negotiate on a daily basis. There is a need for a high level of didacticism in exhibitions, precisely because most of what we're confronted with is different to what we know. And I think that that is the situation that we have in our contemporary times. We are constantly interacting with cultures that are very different, and that there's a lot of, I would say, misunderstanding that that generates, and a lot of tension that generates, and a lot of tolerance that we have to begin having, which means slowing down time in a way to be able to give time to others and to understand. But that's my thinking. I mean, I think also that if you're like a curatorial nerdy, if you love exhibitions, you will always look back into exhibition history. That would be the easiest response, no? But I do think that those two periods are there, that there's a period of reconsideration of how does one form cultural identity or national identity through culture. That is a national project today in many countries because of their increasing multivocal heritage that they're constructing. And on the second hand is because there are exhibitions that have resolved that, and because that have presented that problem already, and that we could very much learn from.
I'll make one last question before, especially the participants must make one of the other questions, but maybe just to have a further context on what we refer to decolonization in this context of the reimagination of an institution. In Europe and in the US, there is definitely a moment of, in the art institutions, there is a broader cultural phenomena, but just specifically speaking of museums and art centers that have certain connection to a colonial legacy or past, either by its naming or by its collections. This includes even museums that hold artifacts that were looted. Let's say that's the major debate around repatriation of objects, either from Africa or Southeast Asia or South Asia or the Americas. But it also, in the US, when it speaks of decolonization, there's also a discussion around the history of Confederacy. Maybe that's more related to some news that circulates in papers here in the Philippines, where there is more and more often protests in the US around trying to take down statues of Confederates that were either slave owners themselves or have very dark narrative in time, but are celebrated publicly through statues. But the term of decolonizing has also migrated to institutional critique in relation to funding as well, in which the decolonizing phenomenon or movement has also questioned funders of where, let's say, the trustees of a board of a museum are part of this phenomenon of rethinking of these power structures within institutions. No? But in this broader term, maybe I think you have a lot to say in relation to all these general discussions. Just to broaden a bit maybe to talk specifically on how in the Netherlands these discussions have been discussed, not only in relation to the Witte de With, but
it's a very it's a subject that has been seen with a lot of on the one hand a lot of support, and on the other with a lot of skepticism. And I think that the fear or the anxiety, more the anxiety than the fear, is in whether the discussions that are associated with decolonizing and specifically as it pertains to street names or monuments or institutions that bear a name from the 17th century. The question is whether all these moves will erase a history instead of address a history. I think that one can negotiate that by different types of strategies, precisely not to erase a part of history, but instead to add to history narratives that have been unaccounted for. I think that that's to begin, meaning you don't just erase by replacing, but instead you add to the history, that you add precisely what has not been spoken about or what has not been written yet. In terms of funding, as you say, it's an interesting relationship because yes, most of the art institutions in the Netherlands are funded primarily through public subsidies, through grants that are received after 4-year plans or 2-year, 3-year, depending on the size of the institution. And so it is unlike most countries in a place where institutionalism actually exists. In our countries, whether it's in Colombia or in Mexico, I'm unsure if in the Philippines, the primary support system is your family, right? That's the families tend to be the strongest institution, I would say. In the Netherlands, I feel that the state is the strongest institution, and it has a lot of benefits, right? Meaning there is it's an amazing country to work in, particularly in the field of the arts. It actually believes and supports the arts and its institutions precisely because they create better citizens, more informed citizens, which is a case of, when our institutions strongest are the families, it creates a very strong level of affection, and it makes us better people, but cultural institutions makes better citizens. Now, there's a difference between being a person and being a citizen in the sense that you take more responsibly questions of community, questions of development, social development, and whatnot. So it is a process. So with that, I want to say is that decolonizing is a process that tends to be very painful for all of our institutions, including Witte de With. It's a process that it's a growing pain in that sense. How do you to grow in such a way that you become more inclusive without, again, forgetting that history that you represent, regardless of the fact that your name does not. And I think that it's one of the growing pains that Witte de With and many other institutions are dealing with at the moment. A very discussed subject was that the Amsterdam Museum, this just happened some weeks ago, it was in the local newspapers, I'm not sure in the international press, but the Amsterdam Museum just changed their galleries of the golden age to 17th century galleries. And you do know about this, you read in the newspaper, yeah. It's a discussion that's very much discussed in the art newspaper. It's taken a lot of attention precisely because, and I believe as well, is that if you work using the politics of description, that means that adjectives should not, the politics of description in such a way that you describe not through adjectives a question of time, but through kind of technical means. So the 17th century replacing the golden age is by way of saying, why don't we just use it in terms of these are the materials that were from that period of time, rather than just speak of that period of time in an elevated way, which would allow you then to include other materials that are from another perspective of the same period of time that has been considered the golden age, when it was not so golden to the counterpart. So I do think that, again, it's not to erase, it's just to address it with a different perspective. And that difference tends to be actually larger than the hegemonic view in the end, right? And I think that that's the way. But I must say, it is a growing pain. It is it's an address to our present that doesn't seem so cohesive. And I think that that's why there's a number of questions that emerge from multiple sides.
So I'll just pass the microphone to anyone in the floor who would like to ask a question, or anything that you would like further clarification, or something that you like. Yes? No? No? Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Hi. Super interesting talk, and I think a lot of us here in the audience are extremely interested in the different ways of understanding decolonizing spaces. Here in the Philippines, I think it's kind of really entering into the minds of the artists and curators, and especially some members of grassroots art communities. And so anyway, I'm just really interested as someone who is interested in institution making, or whatever that even means in the context of the Philippines, where institutions are seen as often very problematic and has a very bad connotation historically. But I think as someone who is interested in institution making, how is it to negotiate with the local community, or as we say, outreach, when there are many needs that a community has besides what contemporary art can offer? And I think, I mean, this is in relation to investment of funds and also inclusion, no? Inclusivity, how to sort of think about the program in the context of a country like the Philippines. Perhaps it's the same in Colombia and Mexico as well, when we use contemporary art to engage with local communities and try to build a better society through programs, through, for in our case, artist residencies, site-specific projects, and education.
I think that I would borrow a reference from the APT, which was an initiative in the UK from decades ago, from the 1960s and 70s. And I actually believe in that strategy very much, and that relates to artist residencies to some extent, which is that you involve artists in decision making, that you involve artists in your immediate environment, in your immediate spaces of interaction, whether that is a boardroom or whether that is a planning session, or whether that is just in a neighborhood. And what I mean by that is that artists have developed another language that is not speech-based. It's a language, the language of the visual arts, or what we call in Spanish also artes plásticas, meaning they have created or disciplined themselves. They have taken the risk of choosing very precarious, most of the time, life path, because they want to be decision makers, right? They are the ones that decide what to draw. They are the ones that decide how to draw it. They are taking decisions every day at every moment. And that's part of artistic freedom, right? That's part of a freedom that they enjoy precisely because they decided, no? And if you involve artists within that context, it means that they will likely influence different ways of looking at the world, and of speaking of the world, and of being represented in the world. And I think that those are the ways in which institutions or institutional building can be done better today, better societies in that sense. And giving them the space of action and giving them the respect that they need, I think, allows to shape more inclusive societies. That's one of the ways in which I see that cultural institutions can actually help in decolonizing. And I know it sounds simple, it sounds very simple, but the truth is that it has lasting effects. And I think that that's one of the ways in which we could contribute as people that work in our institutions to making a much more generous society and making those growing pains of institutionalism be less severe.
Just hearing that, because not recently, but maybe like 5 years ago, precisely in that line of thought, the Tate, in the, let's say, highest rank of trustees, where the very last decisions are taken, there was recently an inclusion of an artist, and a very specific type of artist. It's the filmmaker John Akomfra, who is of Ghanaian heritage. He's a London filmmaker doing incredible work, bringing up discussions of multiculturalism, precisely putting an artist right there on the very top, who takes the final decisions, in a certain type of artist. Yeah. Anyway, I will force somebody from the workshop to.
Who's going to be in the workshop? Oh, so this is other people. Those people that signed up for the workshop.
They're just shy, raising their hands. When would you like to say something? I'm forcing you.
Hi. Well, listening to your talk, I'm very much impressed with the amount of support that the Dutch government has been giving to institutions like yours. In the Philippines, that has always been a very big problem in terms of institutional funding, especially from public, like from the government. And of course, there had been a lot of efforts in the past for artists to create some sort of a union, like an informal collectives, to sustain their practices. Although there are like a lot of course, differences in terms also of like operational and maybe implementation of financing and administrative structures. So I think my question, I have maybe just one quick question now. If we are trying to build like a grassroots collective that could possibly help in activating a certain community to do different artistic engagements, what would be the types of people that we would probably need on board to make decisions like that? Because primarily it has been done that the majority would be artists, and there are a lot of problems in terms of operational side of things, you know. So what would be the, I think, the most idealistic or like the most realistic, you know, mix of people? What type of people would you put in a grassroots collective like that?
I mean, I'll just make a little link as well, because you have your own recent, work experience stems from art in general. That was a very specific small organization. Now you had the experience of working in Documenta, that is larger scale institution that happens every 5 years, and now you're running this arts center. So I guess you will have a broader context of answer that question, not only specifically to the bit.
I think that what I've seen, I'm going to respond it on the various levels. What I've seen, or my experience in Latin America in terms of artist collectives and artist-run spaces have developed, is that they use different kinds of resources besides money to actually create their projects. And human resources is one of the most important ones, meaning they bring together people that can think together, that can make together, that can communicate in more expanded ways. And I think that that's one of the primary resources of collectives and the artist-run initiatives, like independent spaces, independent publishers, and so on, is that their primary capital is the minds and energy and will and skills of people. And I think that that's a lot to say, because at institutions, human resources mean something very different. See? That's a fact. And of course, they have personnel, they have team members that actually make the projects, but the institutions are beyond them in that sense. You know? That's a reality. I think that one of the ways, if there is a goal, not every artist collective or independent initiative has a goal to be transformative in society. That's a fact. Most of them, they are their interests or their intent is to transform one idea into another, period. Right? So when the larger mission is of a collective is to transform society, then I do think that it's social issues that and societies with needs that would be worth engaging with. Right? I think that that's just a fact. If you have that political intent behind one's practice, I think that am I understanding the question correctly? Okay. And then in terms of other institutions, I would say that the support that is required for institutions that are working in countries where there is no governmental support, financial or otherwise, for programming, is that there has to be a diversity of people that one engages with to allow for that development of such initiative or such institution to flourish. And that could be done, there's many different guises of that. There is I love the Kunstverein model in Germany, which is based on membership fees. And those membership fees are associated to, they're very low. So it's like a magazine fee, right? That you pay a stipend a year, and you're engaged in the institution because they can build an art collection collectively. So there's a trust in an expert that is the director or the curator that selects the works that build the collection out of the funds collected by members. And the members have a different relationship to their institution in a way that they are supporting it, but also that they can engage in other kinds of programming. So that's a way in which they can supplement governmental funds and private sponsorships or mission and so on. And the Kunstverein is built by a group of people, meaning originally. And I think that that's actually very, very good. So it's a kind of socialist type of institution in that sense. I find that in many other contexts, individuals that for one reason or the other enjoy wealth have also developed some of the primary cultural institutions in their context. And I am very interested in those individuals that through private foundations, for example, can create educational positions within universities, collections within public institutions, meaning that their wealth allows to not only provide something that a context apparently needs or likely needs, but also that they can strengthen existing institutions. And that is the case of the institutions that I've worked with in the past. How do you add people into the roster of supporters to strengthen existing institutions instead of creating parallel ones? And I think that that's one of the things that is there. I am, as of late, meaning more recently, I've been giving much more attention also to, just in terms of art making, for example, in terms of processes, I've been giving much more attention to artists that can create something within their own means of production, which sometimes has to do with the stretch of their hand or the immediate materials that they're surrounded by or the skill set that they've gained up to their point in life. Much more interested in that reach than in the kind of artistic production that involves a massive neoliberal production scale, meaning that in the processes involved all these facilitators, all these fabricators, all these, all these machines and all this art system to create a work of art. See? So to me, that is one of the things that I have more right now, distance myself, and that is based on my experience, I would say, from an exhibition like Documenta, which I was very happy, and I'm very happy about it. But at the same time, one of the things that I'm trying to step away from and question my own admiration of are those artistic projects that have a similar production scheme as a kind of economic factory. So that's one of the things. So there's an appreciation of things that are within reach, see, of art making that is sensitive to its to the realities that it finds itself in, and to see that with admiration instead of a limitation, which is what we've been trained to see, how we've been trained to think about aesthetics. That. Did I explain myself?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, it got me thinking about our opening on Saturday. Yes, please.
For the last part of your what you just said, but isn't that what biennales and triennales continue to perpetuate? The kind of art that requires all these logistical support. So how do we how can we address that or respond to that and give more voice, more platforms for artists who are able, who work within that limited surrounding. So I understand why there is a need for biennales and triennales, but it seems to be what everybody is looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I suppose that the easier response would be to say we don't have to be everybody, right? That we can be ourselves. And I think that if we have the privilege of running institutions, because it's not everyone that runs institutions, but a certain amount of people that do, then we have to run those institutions by not being subordinate to the system, but by creating a system that works for our local constituencies and not only for the international globe-trotting art world. And I think that that's one of the ways in which we can strengthen and create the art scenes within our communities. And it's very, people love very big, spectacular things. I do as well, but that's within their reach. See, fine. That's just not the only thing, I suppose. And I think that there's a process of sincerity that one has to address to be able to do this. Like this is what I really think that it's a way of seeing art not as a limitation, but as an expression that speaks to a condition, whether it's emotional or economic, right? Political. And most of the work made by artists and curators and institutions, most of the work created outside of the mainstreams is generally seen as limited. And I think that the question is to say, no, it's not limited. It's not limited to the conventions. It is an exploration within the reach in a responsible way, within one's reach in a responsible way.
like to add something since you are one of the curators of the Singapore Biennial? I'm putting you on the spot. You will talk to me.
Yeah.
Well, I think thank you so much, Sophia.
Thank you. I want to say one thing.
Okay.
I'm thinking right now a little bit about I'm thinking a little bit more about the question of the biennales and so on. And one of the things my curatorial practice is by and large shaped by making studio visits and by visiting artists in the context where they're making their work. So traveling, so field research is a key component of my curatorial practice. And one of the things that I learned, and I actually learned more about painting in Cuba than I learned about painting in school or by seeing exhibitions, just by a couple of travels that I made there. And what I learned about painting and with painting was through the conversations of the artists that were painting, that said that the only moment when there was money and spaces for exhibitions was through the Biennale circuit, through the Havana Biennale. And that they questioned, not fully, but that they said we can't just be making installation art, because installation art doesn't mean anything without the framework of an exhibition. And it means something when the Havana Biennale is taking place there. But if I make installation art, which generally occurs with many objects and creates environments that are kind of like the ones of everyday life in Cuba at least, they said it wouldn't mean anything. So in order to maintain a practice, we work within our means and we paint. And by means, they meant the materials that are readily available and the spaces that are readily available, whether that was their house or a so-called studio. Generally, everyone paints at their home, which tends to have many other family members there. And generally, they can get materials to paint or to make things within reach. I'm not talking about the very famous artists from Cuba, the ones that make huge sculpture installations that are, thankfully, for better or worse, included already within a system of production and distribution of the Biennale world. And they said art is thinking, and in order to think, then you have to practice. You have to be making it. And they have chosen then, many of them, to make something, again, that is seen by the conventions or by the critique of the bourgeoisie as painting. But in reality, it is their way of thinking and expressing. And they won't be limited by the fact that there's little materials to do so. Since those trips to Cuba, I have reconsidered my own attachments to and my own appreciation. Meaning, the artists there have taught me how to reconsider painting, which again has little to do with how we learn about painting in art history. They have. I have reconsidered forms of making art that were supposedly not contemporary in order to understand that who cares? You know, this is a medium that is not just, as we were taught, an object of the bourgeoisie. This is what we're taught even in the institutional critique classes in the American universities, right? So I think that that's what I wanted to respond to you in terms of the Biennale circuit as well, is that in many places where the Biennale is, aside from Venice and so on, those are the opportunities that provide artists and their publics to experience art in an expanded field, in an expanded way. But they only happen every couple of years and in every couple of cities. It doesn't happen elsewhere. And artists, regardless of biennales, maintain a practice. And I think the question is to be able to understand those major installations presented within the context of biennales vis-a-vis their daily practice. And sometimes it coincides and it's an expansion, and sometimes it is not, right? And I think that that's the what we learn when studying it contextually. And I do think that, again, one has to return back to where you stand, whether it's in what building you're in, or in what street you're located, or in what city and immediate surrounding you have, in order to create a kind of sensible approach to both institutional practice, curatorial practice, and certainly artistic practice.
Thank you, Sofía.
Thank you.
It will end. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bueno.
There's some refreshments outside.
Yes,
Okay.
there is very nice refreshments, and thank you again to the embassy. It's a great collaboration, and Sofia's visit not only is this talk, but it's the workshops, we're visiting artists, institutions. It really connects the Philippine art scene, at least the Manila scene, with research that Sofía is doing, so we're very grateful. So thank you again, Ateneo Gallery. Thank you.
Thank you.